what I was doing up to the last class. The last class we talked about a massive emigration to the United States from 1870 that ends in 1914. And that the chain migrations of people into particular regions leads to a sharpening of ethnic traditions. So, in the case of my grandmother, an increasing defined sense of what it is to be Swedish or Italian or Jewish, or that sort of sharpened ethnic identity emerges actually in the United States, surprisingly. And these traditions become objects of humor fairly quickly that are consumed by other immigrants in places like vaudeville and the Bowery. Gradually, it's appropriated into American culture and becomes this culture of glorifying, ridiculing, and making fun of American ethnic groups becomes a distinctive American cultural product that moves from vaudeville into the Broadway and then the theater, and by the 19 teens and into the movies. And so this tradition throughout the 20th and the 21st century has become the sort of distinctive American cultural product, which is the movie and film industry. Today, I want to talk about these folks, the middle class, and how the middle class is changing. I want to talk about some older ideas that happened earlier, the environmentalism, the Enlightenment, reason, classical economics. These are some old ideas that go all the way back to the 1760s and 1770s in some cases, and then some new Gilded Age post-Enlightenment views of human personality, very different views of the way humans work that are transmitted mostly in universities. And then some. We'll talk about germs and other discoveries and some of the new and distinctive ways in which the world is understood in the Gilded Age. But to do so, we need to think about universities, because universities go from being at the margin of most Americans' experience to being a more common part of American middle class experience. It's fewer than 1% of people are educated in universities at the beginning of our period in, say, 1870. We get closer to 3 and 4% by the 19 teens and 1920s, and this is going to be where the middle class is going to come from increasingly. The middle class is not going to be just a group of people that are reproduced simply by class, but the university is going to be the place where class is reproduced. So to talk about that, the university becomes a sort of breeding ground for an upper class and an upper middle class. It's connected at first with a small group of colleges that played each other in sports, and this was the Ivy League. Connected with the growth of an upper middle class or upper class are the Greek letter fraternities, where contacts would be made that would be leveraged into social position. The Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity had in 1889 40 congressmen, a Cabot Lodge, and Teddy Roosevelt in 1889. In 1912, it had 18 New York bankers, 9 Boston Brahmins, and 3 directors of Standard Oil. So the route to power in the Gilded Age is increasingly through the university, and it's through the university and these sort of fraternities. As you'll note, this looks a little bit like, if you've ever read any of H.P. Lovecraft's stories, Miskatonic University. And in fact, H.P. Lovecraft is an interesting commentator on the university life. He lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and sees Brown University up close, and he's kind of horrified by Brown University. He doesn't become a student, but his view of this world is in some ways lasting. This new middle class society was open in the sense that it wasn't. And so then, of course, there's sororities as well that emerge in this period. And these fraternities and sororities have their own distinctive songs and others. I've just outed the Chi Omega song, which is supposed to be highly secret. Apologies for that. But this new middle class society was open in the sense that it wasn't a hereditary nobility that you saw in Europe, for example. One needed only money and manners It was closed in the sense that few people in the middle class could afford the costs of an Ivy League education. The American equivalent of the British upper 10, which is the upper 10,000, was an upper 40,000, distinguished by people who had servants, had a particular kind of education, and this was true for women if the family was considered liberal or progressive, and an ability to be interesting at a cocktail party. And so this way of this form of education is the thing that distinguishes the middle and upper middle classes from the working class. And so these organizations and with their songs and stuff like that are crucial in kind of shaping what will become a middle class in the United States, an upper middle class in the United States. All right, so let's start with Enlightenment ideas, just because most of what happens in this period is post-Enlightenment, and so it's helpful to understand what Enlightenment means. Enlightenment ideas they're connected with a few ideas. One is something called environmentalism, which is the idea that environment conditions who you are going to become. So The Prince and the Pauper is an example of a story that preaches environmentalism in the sense of not environmental, not the environmental world, but that environment conditions human development. So you put a poor kid in a wealthy home, he'll learn to read and write and study poetry and start to complain about poor people. Put a rich kid in a poor home and he'll become physically strong at first, but then develop a nagging cough and be uncouth. This was usually or often mixed up with racial ideas. For example, Thomas Jefferson believed that black people would never have the capacity of whites. And so there was an environmentalism, but it was conditioned by sort of racial ideas. This Enlightenment environmentalism became an important critique of inherited wealth in the 1770s and 1780s, and it leads people like Thomas Jefferson to create universities like University of Virginia, which was supposed to be a place for impoverished geniuses to go for free, and support for a kind of education for those people who weren't born to wealth, but could be educated and could be leaders. It was generally in the Enlightenment an association of humans with reason. And that reason distinguishes us from animals, and that some had more reason than others. This is an environmental, the sort of the Enlightenment idea. And the word enlightenment itself is connected with opening the mind to reason, enlightening it, allowing forward movement. It was sometimes anti-religious, seeing faith as a superstition, and sometimes not, seeing reason as a peculiar gift by God. Okay, so that's Enlightenment ideas. And that's, sorry, Prince of the Pauper. Oh, that's terrible. And then finally, secondly, we have what's called classical economics. And classical economics is a view in which price depends on the cost to produce something, the labor theory of value. And all economists up until the Gilded Age believed in this, that labor, that the labor was the thing that set the value of things, that land, labor, and capital were the forces of production, and that capital represented stored up land or labor. Adam Smith, in Wealth of Nations, argued that people will rationally mix these in the best way possible without government interference. Adam Smith is a classical economist, but Karl Marx is also a classical economist who believed that capital represented stolen labor power. That capital was an accumulation of stolen labor power. So Adam Smith and Karl Marx, while we might think of them as being very different kinds of people, one committed to limited government intervention, another committed to socialism and later communism. Both of them were classical economists, and both of them thought of the economic world as being very similar, with very similar constraints. This is going to change very drastically in the Gilded Age, replaced by a new kind of method of thinking about economics. Okay, so some of the challenges to these ideas come about in part because of Charles Darwin. Darwin, in fact, starts with classical economics and develops an idea because he believed that the sort of struggle for survival was important in terms of understanding who would succeed and who would fail. And Darwin develops these three ideas of natural reproduction. Oh, sorry. That's unreadable, isn't it? He argued that organisms reproduce, that they differ slightly, and that they compete for survival. And so over time, over centuries, millennia even, you'll see adaptation that emerges as not as the animals change their, but that certain animals that are better adapted. So he looks at finches kind of famously, and finds that in areas where there are lots of buds and fruits, that finches that have a kind of a beak that can access buds and fruits are more likely to survive, and the ones that don't do not. In areas where there are lots of grubs, those finches that have long, pointy beaks are going to survive, and all of their other cousins are not. And so there are going to be these slight differences that over centuries is going to cause important differences. And so this is Darwin's theory. It's borne out by lots and lots and lots of evidence since then, but it's shocking at the time for many people because it seems to suggest that there are some that God's plan for the earth is not set in stone. That in fact animals have changed over time, plants have changed over time, fungi have changed over time to cope with the stresses of the environment. They reproduce, they differ slightly. The ones that survive are the ones that are better able to survive in that particular kind of environment. Just like the human selection of dogs, pit bulls, for example, designed to deal with bulls, there were natural conditions that selected the faster, the shorter, the most blended in color, for example. It's important that Darwin didn't think it was the best. It wasn't the best. It wasn't, evolution didn't proceed towards some great positive goal. It was just the best adapted for a particular circumstance. All right. So around the same time, we get Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer was a sociologist. He wrote Principles of Psychology in 1855 and First Principles in 1862. And the discipline of sociology kind of comes from Spencer, even though most sociologists are horrified by Spencer now. And where Darwin thought that they differed slightly, for Spencer, he sees evolution not as the best adapted, but the best. Survival of the fittest is the term that comes from Herbert Spencer. He believed that there was a kind of higher evolutionary state for people in wealthier countries. And so this is a sort of racism that's so his idea was that there were better races than others, and these races were more popular and spread further than others. Spencer saw institutions, human institutions, as amenable to the same laws of nature as animals. So thus, a chief is peculiarly suited to tribes, while in more complex societies, you have to separate those responsibilities. The chief of a large tribe has to turn over to judging to an assistant who might become a judge. The actual leading of an army must go to an assistant called a captain. The making of laws goes to an assembly. Preaching goes to a priest. And he calls this functional differentiation. And he says that functional differentiation is just as valid as Darwin's theory of evolution. And so this functional differentiation is important because in a way it's connected back to our middle class young people, in that social forms like religion and law were human creations that evolved out of society's needs at the time. The trouble is, for many people, the trouble with Spencer was the similar problem that they had with Darwin, which is that there's no place for any religion or God here. Spencer says that the New Testament, for example, and its emphasis on doing well, doing good to others, and helping your neighbor and that sort of thing, contradicts the Old Testament and its emphasis on retribution. And so he said that the Old Testament was created with an angry God, which was designed to get people to obey, and that the New Testament was designed to get primitive men to just stop thinking about just themselves. He calls into question people's ideas of justice, morality, and ethics. So this is what Spencerian views are. he sees them as superstitions that were suited to one time and may no longer be suited to others. So there's this sort of scientific racism that's baked into Spencer's ideas, and also this idea that there's functional differentiation and societies develop just like finches, for example. So what is this? What's different about Spencer? Well, Spencer is a post-enlightenment thinker, because whereas in the Enlightenment, people believed that reason was just one thing, that humans had reason, animals didn't have reason, that reason was something that was always a positive thing. According to Spencer, reason is something that evolves. It has a history. And what was a reasonable thing to think for the Old Testament was not reasonable in the New Testament, and so not so true today. So how does this work? So what's the significance of Spencer? Well, what Spencer is very attractive to industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and others who believe in this idea. Many of them, or quite a few of them, reject religion. That's not true of Rockefeller, but it is true of Carnegie. But they want to understand their place in the world. The three sciences that Spencer wants to emulate are mechanics, with their balance and conservation of forces, chemistry with equilibria, and biology with evolution. Spencer's ideas, in a way, are connected in a weird way to this dispassionate Stoic ideal of middle-class manhood that I talked about before. For example, two prescriptions from Spencer were, firstly, that public schools were a terrible idea because they don't force people to take responsibility for their actions in having children. So he thinks that people should have fewer children, and that public schools will only make people have more kids. The second thing for Spencer was he believed that every element of passion and emotion needs to be drained from decisions. Anything passionate in another society necessarily further limits the development of that society. And so when we talked before about this sort of passionless man, the man who is almost like a ghost, this is Spencer's view of the world, and his view about what makes the British Empire the most powerful empire in the world. It becomes a kind of biological and mechanical justification for imperialism. So let's think about this for a second. Let's back up for a second. There is a biological way of understanding the world that comes out with Darwin that's very important and very powerful and very necessary. The trouble is that Spencer kind of takes this and runs with it and turns in these directions that sort of justify a kind of racial order with British subjects at the center. Spencer himself was a railway director in Britain and becomes very, very popular in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. 1880s and 1890s. So Spence, the survival of the fittest becomes a kind of mechanical justification, biological justification for imperialism, that other societies are like us before we evolved. And so they're worthy of study. And that's right. So Darwin believed in natural selection, but he didn't believe in survival of the fittest. Darwin believed that survival was really the best suited to the environment. And so there was no high level. It wasn't that things were going to get better and better and better over time. It's just that things changed based on environmental circumstances. That's Darwin's view. Spencer views this world as leading to a kind of pinnacle of human civilization, which is the British imperial self. And so other people need to basically emulate Britain. So this is important. The survival of the fittest idea is important for helping us understand imperialism. For understanding the period from the 1880s through World War I, really, where there's a scramble for Africa, a scramble for China, a scramble for South Asia. South Asia is part of the British Empire, but a scramble particularly for Asia and China to take pieces of it and make those part of either the British Empire or the French Empire or the Prussian Empire. And it's important. It's a little less significant at first in the United States because the United States early on doesn't have a kind of formal empire in this way. It's not until the 1890s when we see the war over Cuba that we see the U.S. becoming more of a kind of an imperial power in the sense that Britain and France are. It also becomes a justification, this survival of the fittest idea, not just for imperialism, but also for laissez-faire. Don't interfere in the natural workings of the market. They make some people poor. That's a good thing. Those people are unsuited and have the wrong seed, and you don't want them reproducing. Darwin did not really believe this, or he partly believed it, but Spencer believed it wholeheartedly. So together, Darwin and Spencer open up a whole Pandora's box by pointing out the ways in which humans were like animals, competing for food, competing for mates, changing socially over tens of thousands of years. They call all sorts of things into question. Are people driven by reason or by the desire to procreate and eat? Right? Are the races of man really different steps on an evolutionary ladder, as Spencer says? Is religion just a social product designed to induce certain behaviors? If we're related to animals, does that change our duty to them? So Darwin opens up this box, and Spencer kind of turns it in the direction that justifies imperialism and justifies laissez-faire, justifies no intervention in the market. In some sense, we're still dealing with it, reeling from the Darwinian revolution. Yeah, so Spencer's ideology is a justification for civilizations bringing others into the fold for survival of the fittest. That basically the presumption is the Ottoman Empire, for example, is broken because it's behind, and the empire is shrinking, and therefore the people are maybe not manly enough, not the men and the women are not fully evolved enough, and so it's the fully evolved British institutions or the French institutions that need to be imposed on those people. Yeah, and they do justify two seemingly very different philosophies: a small government in the sense of laissez-faire, but also empire. And it is confusing, but that's precisely what Spencer and all of his devotees believed, is both laissez-faire and the importance and the significance of empire. So Spencer demonstrates white man's burden kind of stuff, exactly. Spencer demonstrates the dangers of what's called scientism. And this is a word you may not have heard before, but it's basically applying scientific principles that are proven in one area into another. Right? So taking ideas like biological, like Darwin's theory of evolution, and applying it to society, principles of equilibrium, and applying it elsewhere. Yeah, it is funny that they get so intertwined, and in part that's because I think as late as the 20th century, people still had these Spencerian ideas kind of tangled up with Darwinian ideas. If you talk to geneticists, they're horrified that anyone still believes in Spencer, but in the kind of popular imagination of many people, particularly in Europe, these two things are baked together. And as you say, some people didn't, thought that Darwin basically proved that there were races of people, and that some races were better or stronger than others. Okay, so that's a post-enlightenment idea because it's a different sense of reason, that reason may grow out of the desire to procreate and eat, and that's it's a very different view of religion, and yeah, so it's a post-enlightenment idea. Another post-enlightenment idea is neoclassical economics, which emerges around the same time and is often sometimes connected with Spencer, but I want to separate the strands a little bit. Oh, geez, sorry about this. I moved. So the neoclassical economists all publish right around the same time. Yevon's Theory of Political Economy, Menger's Principle of Economics, and Walras's Elements of Pure Economics all come together around 1874. And I've moved, my head's in the way. So they all start with David Ricardo's observation from, I want to say the 18 teens or something like that. And if you look at this map here, what David Ricardo discovered years and years earlier is that the price of food didn't depend on the cost to produce, but it depended in part on the demand for it. And he had early proposed the idea that land on the margin of cultivation would be unused if land prices were low, and food prices were low. No, Malthus is not. He's a predecessor to both. He's a predecessor to the neoclassical economists. Malthus writes in the 1760s and 1770s. Weirdly, Malthus is interpreted by Darwin. Darwin says that he is applying Malthus to the biological world. So Malthus is older than this. But Ricardo's observation is that if food prices are high, that people will go out to marginal lands and settle them, and rents will go up there. And if wheat prices are low, food prices are low, that those lands will be left behind and rent prices will drop. So he sees this happening, and he does this mapping to identify basically prices of land and then whether marginal land is going to be used or not. And he says that the marginal land is going to be used more if the food prices are high, and more people are going to get involved in farming if food prices are high. So this is something that he discovers a while ago, but doesn't really fit into economics as people understand it. And then neoclassical economics comes along and takes Ricardo's idea and turns it into what we call neoclassical or marginal economics. So there are assumptions there are three assumptions in neoclassical economics, this economics post 1871. One is that people are rational. The second is that they maximize utility, so they're going to shift to other things. So if wheat prices are going to go up, people are going to go into producing wheat. If iron prices are going to go up, then people are going to abandon the farms and go produce iron. So people will shift, they'll maximize their utility. And third, people will act independently and therefore can be measured mathematically. So their actions can be measured mathematically. Okay, so let's take a look at this image here to give you a sense of what this means. So basically, the premise is that the red and blue line, where the red and blue line meet in the second graph here, is where supply and demand met, and this is the price of, say, let's say, cars in 2005, and the number of cars that are going to be produced at a given price, these are cheap cars, are the red line. So the people are going to produce at $2, only 40 cars will be produced. At $3, something like 70 cars will be produced, and at $4, something like 140 cars are going to be produced. So more people are going to produce more cars if the price goes up. That's the supply curve. The demand curve is another curve, which is that what people are willing to pay and how many things will be bought. So at $4, 40 people will buy these cars. At $3, 75 people will buy them, and at $1, 100 people will buy them. Does that make sense? So that's a supply curve and a demand curve. Now, neither of these things are things that can actually really be directly measured. So this is something that's a little bit confusing about neoclassical economics, is that they argue that there's a supply and a demand curve and they meet at the price. So what happens then is if production prices go up, it gets more expensive to produce cars. Steel prices go up, for example. Then the story is that we're going to move to that green line. We're going to move to that green line. And the green line is what happens when the price of steel goes up and the price to produce cars is going to go up. And so the supply curve is going to change, and it's called moving to the left. So the supply curve moves to the left because the cost the cost that will be give at a particular price, hardly anyone is going to produce cars if the price is $2. A few more people will produce it at $3. A few more will produce it at $4. And what we see is where the price and where the supply and demand meet at this new point has gone from $3 to $3.50. Okay. So what does this mean? This complicated way of arriving at supply and demand is basically a very different way of thinking about economics. The effect of this view is important for us. We don't, fully understanding it, I think, is not that important. But the effect is that there are no hard and fast rules for understanding the price of something. We need to know what the supply curves and the demand curves are to guess the price of something. But there's no just price. There's no correct price. If bread prices are, $1 a pound, it's because the supply and demand curves met at $1. This is very different from the way people think about prices, particularly in this period and earlier. People think that there's a right price for food, and if the price of food or anything goes up, then those people are price gougers. People are gouging. So we use terms like this with this other kind of Enlightenment view of prices, that the amount of labor that went into producing this bread hasn't changed. And so the price itself shouldn't change if demand goes up. The point of neoclassical economics is that we can't ever guess what the price of something is going to be. We just have to let the market decide what the suppliers and the demanders are going to do. And there's no correct or just price. And, oh, sorry, I've cut off here at the bottom. And so there's no correct or just price, and it looks like negotiation between curves. So, sorry about that. I need to work on my PowerPoint skills. So what's important about this is it sort of removes the taint of speculation, gambling, and profiteering. All those terms previously were used to describe certain kind of economic relationships. What neoclassical economics suggests is that there's no such thing as speculation, gambling, or profiteering. All are ways of irrational responses to market conditions. And as Jacob and others have said, this sounds a little bit like Spencerianism, which justifies selfishness and accumulation, but it removes the moral twinge that comes with an increase in prices. When Jay Gould says he's going to charge what the market will bear, that's no longer an unacceptable position. This is just basically where supply and demand curves have met. It suggests that profit is acceptable, and also that it will always be small, because there are always going to be other firms that are going to jump in to produce something if prices go up. So what does this do for economics? Well, what it does is it turns attention away from the people like Jay Gould and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and others, and towards restricted categories of profit that include monopoly and duopoly. So basically, if there is a market working, then there's nothing to complain about, really. The prices have gone up for railway service or something like that. It's because of a meeting between supply and demand curves. And the primary thing to focus on after we think in this sort of neoclassical way is about monopoly and duopoly. This is really important in American economic thought, because it's going to turn our attention away from the sort of robber barons and towards a fairly restricted thing, which is monopoly and duopoly. And American antitrust and other things like that are going to rely on this. Now, to say this, most Americans do not believe in neoclassical economics in this period. The economy in the late 19th century was political economy, and it was taught by ministers throughout the United States. But it will become the standard method of thought in the US and Europe. And students who go to university by the 1880s and 1890s are learning neoclassical economics, this new kind of economics. Okay, before I talk about how this is post-enlightenment, I want to talk about the third case, because I think it helps. And the third case of post-enlightenment thought is Freud, Sigmund Freud, and psychology. So psychology is the insight that there may be an unseen world below where reason operates. So just as the Enlightenment view thought that reason was always a good thing and finding reason was always important and that humans are driven by reason, Freud believed that there was an unseen world where reason did not operate. Freud started out in the 1870s by interpreting what was called hysteria. And hysteria initially was something that was thought to be a female problem, originating in the Histes, literally. And what he starts to do is under hypnosis determine that people's hysteria was a kind of energy inside them that came from trauma earlier in their lives. Now, parts of we still believe in psychology, but parts of Freud we partly abandoned, and using hypnosis to determine people's problems is hardly ever done anymore. Yeah, well, so this is used to break up Standard Oil, not because of prices, but because it's a monopoly. Because the presumption is it's a monopoly. It's a good question that Jacob's asking, but the focus is goes away from whether somebody is making a lot of money, which was seen under the older political economy as evidence that there was something wrong. Famously, Adam Smith thought that merchants were a bad thing. Because they produced without they made money but without producing anything, to this other view that it's really monopoly and duopoly that's the problem. Okay, sorry, back to Freud for a couple minutes. So he sees sexuality and aggression in the id. He's got the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the sort of unregulated uh, drive that everyone covers up. And so if we think about Star Trek, for example, id is Captain Kirk, right? He acts impulsively, instinctively, often stupidly. He does things without thinking. He's pure id. Um, and then the ego is the question of is more, what's going to happen to me if I do this awful thing. And so the ego steps on top of the id and says, don't do that because you're going to get arrested. Don't do this because you're going to look ridiculous. And that's the ego. And so that's the kind of bones of the Star Trek. And McCoy, exactly, McCoy. And then the super ego is even higher than that, and it's the sort of attempt to explain the entire world in the context of these desires, which are kind of ungovernable, and that's the Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock is the super ego. So what Freud comes up with is the idea of transference, the shifting of a feeling about a parent and a sibling onto another. So that's where we get the term father figure, is from Freud, when someone becomes a father figure to you. Some other terms, repression is a term that comes from Freud, where you hold down those emotions. And compulsion is also a Freud term, that if something's been denied to you, you want to do it again and again and again. If something was denied to you when you were a child, you go to it again and again and again. So some things about this view is that it's similar to the kind of Gilded Age idea of a body as a human motor and consciousness as a steam engine. So the pure id is the kind of energy, the raw energy that's compressed and held bottled up by the ego and the superego. So these three sciences of human personality, social Darwinism, neoclassical economics, and psychology, all emerge around the same time in the US and Europe. And what's post-enlightenment about them is, first of all, that in their view of people as individuals, they see them as driven by desires. So that's rational in neoclassical economics. That is, that that people aren't driven by logic, but they're driven by their desires. These desires have a rational history. Freud believes, these desires are rational, and those desires, there's nothing wrong with those desires. So if you want to buy something, unless it's killing other people in neoclassical economics, that's a kind of sensible thing. For Freud, that desire has a history. It's not itself rational, but there's a kind of rational explanation for why that desire is it. Right. Did we make it through a Freud talk without talking about it? We did. We did. We didn't talk about the Oedipus complex, right, and killing one's father to marry one's mother. But that's also from Freud. Thank you, Jacob. Um, So for Freud, those desires have a rational history. For Spencer, those desires are necessarily repressed and are dangerous, and they represent problems. So each of them think about reason differently. Reason is driven underground. It's either historicized for Freud. It's turned into just raw desire, which is drives the economy in neoclassical economics, or it's represented by the id and the ego. So environmentalism. Remember, we talked about environmentalism in the Enlightenment Ideas. Environment is mixed with race in Spencer, so that there are smart races and not so smart races, and that races create the environment. So that's very different from this idea, the prince and the pauper idea, that if you grow up with wealth, you'll think like a wealthy person, but you'll also have expanded capacities for reason. The environment in economics, in neoclassical economics, is entirely immaterial. That environment does not, the desire is the same more or less across the board with humans. That we are unlikely to see that environment doesn't really matter collectively. That what matters is effectively desire. Environment, though, for Freud is profoundly distorting. That if you grow up in an environment in which you, for example, have a narcissistic mother or father, or have a domineering parent, or go through some trauma, that your environment is going to be profoundly distorting in your life, and it's going to mess you up. So there are new sciences of description that are also in part of these new traditions: statistics, chemical weight, and energy. But they provide acid criticism of many institutions that people took for granted in the Gilded Age, including the church, the family, and the state. Yeah, this is complicated. This sort of nature versus nurture issue is not going to be resolved by any of these thinkers, really. But the kind of things that were thought to be true and obviously correct in the old view have gone away. Now, these traditions, this way of thinking about the world, these new ways of thinking about the world, are transmitted in universities, and universities are very different in the Gilded Age than they have been previously. Universities previously, if you were a university student in the 1820s or 1830s, you had to learn Latin and Greek. You had to recite things, and basically just pure memorization, and you'd be rapped on the knuckles if you couldn't remember the next line in the Iliad or something like that by an instructor. And here in the universities post 1865, in part because of the land grant money, we see much more research take place inside universities, so that researchers are also teaching. And rather than basically recitation, you see a lecture growing out of the latest research. That's the idea of the university. Okay. Let me just whip through some important changes, the scientific changes that really radically change people's understanding of the world. First is Mendeleev, who is in fact basically a high school teacher in Russia. He's in a gymnasium, and he basically tries to make a chemistry book for people in Russia that's in Russian. And he does so, and he kind of lays out so atomic weight is being discovered, and he lays out the atomic weight. And bear with me here for a second. He's from Tobolsk in Siberia. His mother tried to get him into a university, but he got a degree in St. Petersburg and then goes back to high school. He lines up the elements in a table based on their atomic weight when he writes this textbook, and he suggests that similar elements can be lined up in columns. There are lots of gaps. There are lots of things that haven't been discovered yet, but he confidently predicts that these are elements that have not yet been discovered. So in a weird way, the teaching of chemistry brings about one of the most important discoveries of the 19th century, which is uh, what elements are there and what they're likely to be, and where we get the gases and the noble gases and all these other sorts of things. They grow out of just the layout of the periodic table as Mendeleev comes up with it, which is basically initially as a teaching tool. Julius Von Sachs discovers transpiration and movement of liquids through plants. And he discovers that plants have a circulatory system just as much as humans do. And this radically changes people's views about the relationship between plants and humans, the suggestion that plants and humans may have similar final, primary origins. Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian monk and high school teacher in Moravia, comes up with, in our period, the passing on of traits. Joseph Lister comes up with a new way of determining, of basically performing surgery. He believes that children. He believes that operations, that there are germs. We're reading about this week, that there are germs that are on people's hands. He believes that that doctors are actually transmitting puerperal fever to mothers. And he happens to run a children's hospital. He has a friend who has a whole bunch of extra carbolic acid that's being produced. And a great thing about a children's hospital, as Lister sees it, is that you can do anything to them, to kids in a hospital, including pouring boiling carbolic acid onto wounds that they have. And what he discovers, not exactly by accident, is that by covering wounds with carbolic acid, that you can sterilize them and prevent them from getting worse. And so basically sterile operations, a C-section that doesn't kill the mother, is a product in a way of Lister's discoveries about infectious diseases and how they can be eliminated. Maxwell is the person who suggests that magnetism and electricity could be unified. He predicts magnetic waves without any evidence that there are such things, but he's proved right by the 1870s and 1880s. He predicts rings around Saturn, and he writes a treatise on electricity and magnetism. And so this is Maxwell. Jacob Van 't Hoff proposes that the carbon molecules are asymmetrical, and this in a tetrahedral shape. And I think it's because his head was tetrahedral shape, if you see in this image. But he predicts that there will be tetrahedral shape in hydrocarbons without, this is long before there are ways of actually seeing this, and he as well is proved right. And Theodore Coker discovers that the body can operate without the thyroid gland. Okay. So many folks take these observations, which are very powerful, and make radical transformations in disease and chemistry and things like that, and apply them in peculiar directions. So we see the dissociation of disease with race in this period, but also a weird connection or imagination that connects hygiene to race, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the readings we have for this week. William Crocker Gorgas drastically alters sanitation in colonial places and makes colonial settlement in tropical regions possible. He does so by figuring out, or actually stealing someone else's research, which figures out that yellow fever is transmitted by mosquito. And so when the U.S. Establishes itself and gains control in 1898 because of the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk about, Carlos Juan Finley, who's a doctor, isolates the mosquito as the cause of it. He then Gorgas uses this to basically introduce mosquito netting, eliminate all pools of standing water, fumigating streets, and this allows Europeans to settle in colonial regions that they hadn't previously before. And this is partly why we see a movement, a scramble for Africa, and a scramble for southern China and Vietnam and elsewhere, because it's possible now for Europeans to escape yellow fever, which had been a big killer. It also allows the creation of the Panama Canal. Right, because he introduces these police measures that lead to lower mortality rates than in many southern places. All right, we're at the end here. So some technologies here, the Gatling gun and the machine gun also make it possible to expand into these regions. And One person, I'll end with H.P. Lovecraft, is horrified by what happens in university. He's actually ends up ghostwriting lots and lots of papers for scientists in Brown University. And what he discovered in his fiction is a way of kind of wrestling with this world that he sees, in which this sort of confidence in science leads people to drastically overstep, to open up things that they never should have opened up, to bring about a world that is horrifying. The most merciful thing in the world, he wrote, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinities. Um, yes, okay, sorry. Each straining its own direction have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up terrifying vistas of reality and our frightful position therein. Uh, yes, about the exam, I would not recommend going over the videos unless you missed one. You might watch it on YouTube at double speed with the captions on if there's a part that you think that you missed. Um, I don't think skimming the readings makes sense. I would take notes from the readings. So make basically just enough to fill a note card on each of the readings so that you have stuff that you can kind of call to mind when you need to write the paper. Everybody is allowed to have notes on the midterm. You're going to have 24 hours from the time I hand it out to when you turn it in, and so just pick the times that you want to do it. You can refer to your notes. You can have notes on the midterm. I would not suggest going to Wikipedia to try to answer these questions because it won't do well. As you've already seen, I think Wikipedia is not your friend when it comes to understanding many of these things that we've discussed. Um, but yeah, you could go back to. I would say that the lecture notes will be as slightly more useful to you than the reading notes will be slightly more useful to you than the lecture notes. The lecture notes, I hope, will allow you to stitch some of these very disparate readings together. That's right. It's Monday the 12th that I'll be handing it out on ELC. Okay. Thanks so much. Sorry to go over yet again. Yes, looking over some of the packback questions would be a useful way to study, thinking, because some of the questions that people have asked on packback are in fact things that I'm likely to be using in the exam. Other questions? Sorry, I know it's past time. We will have a Zoom discussion on Friday, so we'll have more stuff. Have a great day, and see you guys on Friday.